soon I'm going to be making a racing game tier list on Twitch, but before I do that, I wanted to know, what do y'all think is the greatest racing game of all time? Assetto Corsa, but if we're talking about arcade racers, then I'd have to go with Need for Speed Pro Street.
Assetto Corsa has become the only racing game I will ever need.
Play Assetto Corsa.
As long as I've got
Assetto Corsa, no
hesi
greater
greater
than
than
any
any
racing
racing
game
game
produced
produced in the last
Get
10
Assetto
years.
Corsa.
Make your own racing
Assetto Corsa. Can you make a video about Assetto Corsa? You know what? Sure. I've been getting requests to talk about Assetto Corsa practically since I started making game reviews back in 2022, although I was always a bit hesitant to tackle a topic as different as AC, mainly because of just how different it was and still is from basically any other racing game that I've covered, or even really played. My channel mainly covers arcade racing games, except for the 3 times I've covered Simcades, and for over half of my channel's lifespan, I didn't even own a wheel, but after I got a direct drive wheel back in March, I was finally able to sit down and try out some of the amazing sims I had been hearing about for so long, particularly the one that I had heard everyone talking about like it was the greatest racing game that had ever been made. This is Assetto Corsa, arguably the most elaborate racing sim I think I've ever seen. Although Assetto Corsa is one of the most unique simulators in terms of how it's played and experienced, it didn't start out that way. And to get the full picture of why, we need to start with this. This is Netcar Namie, and most of you probably have no idea what this is. This was developed in 2002 and revised throughout 2003, not by Kuno Simulazioni, excuse my terrible Italian pronunciation, but by Stefano Kunos Casillo, who worked on Netcar in his spare time. Netcar was unique for its simplistic and straightforward design, sacrificing all elements of aesthetic, progression, customization, and to a large extent gameplay. Also, Stefano could focus on perfecting the physics. And if that sounds familiar, it's because that's basically how most sims work. But I gotta reinforce, this was just one guy, so he dropped everything not necessary to the driving experience. The speedometer is a square with your speed and gear number on it, and I got annoyed as an American because it only reads in kilometers. The game finished with a grand total of 8 cars and 4 tracks, all rendered in no detail, and the game only features a free practice mode. There's no AI drivers to practice against. Although there is multiplayer, however, I obviously couldn't find a server in a no-name game from 2003. But that all makes sense, keeping in mind that this was just one person still. And it actually started a few trends that would continue into almost everything Kunos would make going forward, the biggest one being mod support. Not long after the final version of Netcar was posted, they released a modding kit that allowed you to add your own cars into the game, giving many creative players the ability to make the game truly their own, as well as building upon the great base that was already there. Because another thing that was started here was Kunos and later his team's commitment to making the driving experience as realistic as possible, with, of course, their current technology, time, and capital. Because for a game from 2002-2003, back when one of the best wheels that you could get on the market looked like this, and even an in-the-know sim racer would probably look at you funny if you even mentioned you had a direct drive wheel, this game feels shockingly good today. Now, it's obviously aged, but you can feel the elements that would still carry over into today, much of which was improved massively in 2006. Having founded Kunos Simulazioni the year prior, Kunos and his small team began work on a sequel to Netcar, entitled Netcar Pro. And in many ways, this game serves as a major stepping stone towards the Assetto Corsa we know today. Again, this is a very bare-bones, pure driving experience, but it featured way more cars and tracks. Better mod support, better online, better single-player, more immersive gameplay elements like adjusting the car in the pits instead of having a Windows XP pop-up, and significantly better physics. These physics are so good that, in some instances, I found myself preferring the feeling of these cars over the ones in Assetto. Although, as a whole experience, Assetto delivers a more consistent driving feel. I played on the version released in 2011, which, as far as I can tell, was the latest, and that also should show you another trend that it would start for Kunos: long support cycles. Because this wasn't in an era where games really got long live service updates adding in tons of new content and needed fixes like we see today. Back in 2006, few games really did that outside of MMOs and maybe games like the Half-Life episodes, if that counts. Netcar Pro and the soon-to-be-released iRacing were actually fairly ahead of the curve in terms of continually updating and improving their games, which really shows revisiting these games now. After Netcar, Kunos was contracted out by Ferrari of all companies to help set up an online competition, where players from all over the world would drive that year's F1 car on their famous test track Fiorano, in hopes of beating a time set by Felipe Massa. The game would be updated with a couple more cars and tracks, but due to server upkeep and the lack of interest after the competition had ended, the servers were shut in 2015. However, due to a couple recent advancements, a crack now exists, which is why I'm able to play it now. Despite this featuring the fastest cars ever officially put into a Kunos game up to that point, this almost feels like a slight step back physics-wise, with the cars being a little too light and loose, which became apparent when they took the money from this venture, as well as the capital from the moderately successful Netcar Pro, and put it into their next massive project. Debuting in early 2013, Assetto Corsa seemed like another evolution in the framework Kunos had developed with Netcar, and for the most part, that rung pretty true. The game now featured more realistic elements outside of the core driving experience, which itself was stiffened up a little to give the player a better feel for the road surface of many racetracks, as well as other tweaks and changes to give the driving a feel which was as close to real life as they could get at the time, and put it in conversation with other hardcore sims like iRacing and R-Factor 2. They also added some single-player quality of life features like the ability to race against AI players in the single-player mode, new tracks for drifting and drag racing, a much larger base car list, and an extremely basic campaign which was somewhat designed to show the players the fundamentals of driving in this game. It was a major upgrade on just about every front, and would keep getting better with continuous updates and DLCs over the next few years, until 2018 with the announcement of Assetto Corsa Competizione, a GT3-focused spin-off of the main game. But that's not actually where the story ends for the original Assetto Corsa, because like with the previous Netcar games, Assetto Corsa had amazing mod support, although AC actually had a few major advantages over Netcar, the biggest one being that it came out at a time when sim racing in general was steadily increasing in popularity, both due to the ever-growing number of sims being released every year, and the fact that the hardware sims now required was both becoming better and more readily available to most consumers. This meant that over the coming years, Assetto Corsa would go through many changes which were spurred on primarily by its dedicated modding community. Stuff like the standardization of a common game launcher, because everyone agreed the base game launcher was actual garbage. The building of communities around racing, drifting, wangan, toge, and more, and the game's consistently growing install base. That last point would actually be expanded upon even more, because in 2020, the game and sim racing as a whole experienced a massive boom in popularity from a combination of factors stemming from the pandemic. meaning the modding scene and its communities now had more players than ever, and they were updating and expanding rapidly. This means that nowadays, Assetto Corsa has more content available for it than it has at any other time in its history, and it's still today one of the top simulators for physics and support. So what's the issue with it? The issue comes from the current conversation I've seen around the game, mainly coming in two distinct forms. People who think arcade racing games are for casuals and children, and that sims are the final or best iteration on what a racing game should be, and people who say just because they only play Assetto Corsa, Assetto is the only racing game you need. You can probably see where the issues start there, because if you think about the game as it is in its current state, it's a good, if mechanically limited, simulation sandbox racing experience. But if you compare it to the competition, you might begin to see the issues. Because something that's been bouncing around in the back of my head since I first heard about AC was, who is this game for? I implied throughout the game's background that it was always intended to be a hardcore racing sim, which is true. However, the true hardcore don't really use AC as much as you'd expect. When it released, most of them stuck with games like iRacing, Race Room, and R-Factor 2, games which have more fleshed out mechanics in terms of the overall racing experience, and not just the driving. So to get a better idea of who this game is really for, I want to look at three things. What the game is, what the game has become, and what the game isn't. Let's start with the first category. What I'm talking about here is almost all the content found in the original base game. Now many will correctly argue that this isn't the experience for most players, but there is a significant number of players who have never played the game modded before, primarily on the console versions of the game. While the PC version is far and away the most popular version of the game, the consoles are not an insignificant amount of the player base, and I should know because I bought this. The Xbox One version, and I was thoroughly disappointed. I had heard good things about this game, but going into it with relatively few expectations, I was fairly underwhelmed. I knew the game was going to be difficult for me because I was playing a hardcore sim using just a third-party Xbox One controller, but I figured I'd just keep playing because of how good the rest of the game was, and I'd eventually learn the physics. So I clicked on the career mode, as I would in every other racing game, and I was greeted with the most basic career mode I'd ever seen in a racing game. And that's when I realized this game is shockingly content limited in its base form. Less so in terms of how many cars and tracks you have, and more what you can do with them. Now that's not a bad thing if you went into it with the mindset of a sim or with the knowledge of how the last few games by Kunos were. But when all you've heard about it is how great it is and how it's apparently the best racing game, this does not give a very good first impression. I dropped the career mode almost immediately and went to try out the multiplayer mode, guessing maybe it was similar to Forza Horizon in that it cut much of its single player content to focus on more fleshed out multiplayer. No, just a bunch of lobbies with little cohesion and no general matchmaking. I've also found out by talking with more active people in the AC community that the game has a history of spotty reliability on its online servers, which I guess makes sense given I can count on one hand the number of recent racing games that actually have reliable online. This game was also just lacking in a lot of areas outside of physics, like customization, stylization, progression, almost all gameplay unrelated to basic racing, although they did include the aforementioned drift and drag tracks. This experience also extends to the PC version, with it having an even more obtuse UI design and coming out a year and a half before the console ports. From the off, this game was not that impressive to me as a racing game, or even a sim racing experience, mainly because of how little there was to do and just how mundane all the things there were to do felt. But that's not the experience most people are talking about when it comes to this game. That would come with what the game would eventually turn into. The modding scene for AC was arguably stronger at launch than with any other Kunos project, which is saying a lot given how much those games were modded even back in the 2000s. The modding scene for AC has transformed the game into an expansive sandbox for almost any kind of car enthusiast. You want to make a grid of 1970s and 80s F1 cars on a millimeter accurate Red Bull ring? Go for it. You want to drift a tuned MX-5 at Tsukuba? Well, if you don't suck at drifting like me, sure. You might even want to blast down the Wangan Expressway in a souped-up MR2 on one of the best-looking versions of the highway. Perfectly doable. The modding community that this game has built up has gotten to the point where, with few exceptions, there's some kind of car and track combination which would appeal to any racing or even driving enthusiast. And I mentioned plain driving because of a really interesting statistic that I noticed. On almost all of the major websites I found for downloading Assetto Corsa mods, some of the most downloaded maps aren't significant racetracks or popular street racing locations as you'd expect, although they are up there. It's long stretches of tighter but usually more barren driving roads like canyons and beachsides, which tells me a notable amount of the players probably bought this game and have never even done a regular race. Just cruised around in cars and locales they liked, which I think is pretty unique. There are even some car mod packs like the NFS cars or No Hesi car packs, which give you such high levels of grip that they lower the basic skill floor required to play a sim like Assetto. And speaking of No Hesi, this is another area where AC is at its best. Its community. There are so many servers that specialize in connecting people with common interests in the game. There's No Hesi, SRP, Toge Union, LFM, and hundreds of smaller servers and websites dedicated to various types of driving. This has been and will continue to be one of AC's strongest assets. However, this is also where some of my grievances with AC lie, which brings me on to what this game isn't. When people talk about this game as being one of the best racing games, I immediately begin comparing it to other racing games to see how it stacks up. And of all games possible, there are three that AC reminds me of. BeamNG Drive, Forza Horizon 5, and even though it's not a racing game, Gary's mod. I'll start with Beam. Beam and AC, as different as they may seem on the surface, actually share a massive amount of similarities. Both were developed by effectively indie studios who honed their craft with about a decade of smaller projects which led up to their creation. Both were simulators which aimed to be the most realistic in one area of the car experience, Assetto's being driving and Beam's being crashing. And both games have thrived due to their significant online followings and prolific modding communities. These two games are great at what they set out to do, but for whatever reason I get significantly more enjoyment out of the sandbox that Beam provides, despite Assetto's strengths. I'd say this is because of two things about those games that kind of stem from the same thing. To start, BeamNG just gives you more freedom. Assetto Corsa lets you change the tire pressure, suspension settings, and computer assists all from the pit menu, while Beam lets you change your car's engine, the time of day, or even the damn gravity while still being able to drive your car. And this doesn't just extend to the environment, because unlike in Assetto where you either have to learn how to make your own models or, as I've learned, oftentimes just steal models to make your own cars and add them to the game, in Beam, you can use basic tools like automation, where you can literally just build your own car in a way that is still very detailed, but isn't super overwhelming to the average player. This means that you can play with the game more like an open sandbox, instead of an experience limited by the creative and technical abilities of others. And similarly to that, Beam also doesn't take itself as seriously as Assetto does. As mentioned before, Beam lets you play around with stuff a lot more than AC does, which means if you want to, you can transform Beam into an entirely different experience. To better illustrate where AC falls short as a racing sandbox, we need to look at the next game, Forza Horizon 5. Now, I will admit, I have been an outspoken critic against this game for a while, but that was partially because I was looking at the game as a continuation of the open yet still enjoyable single-player racing game that FH1 was. FH5, on the other hand, is a game that basically gives you all of its tools in the first couple hours and tells you to have at it from there. FH5 understands its market by knowing that while people do like the ability to make and do anything, especially in terms of car and track customization, they also like convenience. It has online matchmaking that, if you ignore the possibility of loading for 2 minutes, sitting in an empty map waiting for the event to end and sitting for another 2 minutes, is one of the more straightforward in the genre currently. That is to say, Horizon Open is a good way to hop into events if you actually just want to boot up the game and get straight to racing or drifting. Not perfect, you still have to go through a handful of obnoxious menus, but better than AC, because it's clear where you need to go instead of scanning through a mile-long server list or scouring the internet for communities. Which brings me on to the last game I mentioned, Garry's Mod. While I know it's odd to compare a dedicated racing sim to a physics engine sandbox, I do it for a particular reason. That being, unlike Assetto, Garry's Mod isn't alone. When people say Assetto Corsa is the best racing game, they're oftentimes focusing too much on the game's technical aspects solely in racing, and not in any other places. But as far as I can tell, that's how most genres judge their games. Shooters shouldn't be judged on how many guns they have, they should be judged on how fun they are to use. Fighters shouldn't be judged on how realistic their portrayal of fighting is, but on how engaging their fighting is. And races don't live or die by how good the driving is, but how that driving and the rest of the game facilitates making the racing better. That's why I bring up Garry's Mod, because if you were to look up what the greatest first-person shooters of all time are, you're not likely to find Gmod on that list. But what you are likely to find is Half-Life 2, the game to Gmod's sandbox. A game that actually has gameplay, story, presentation, and innovation that still makes it feel great as a singular standalone experience. Now that might make it sound like I don't like Gmod, but that couldn't be any further from the truth. It's up there as my second favorite sandbox game of all time. But that's kind of the point. Even my favorite sandbox game, Minecraft, while technically also fitting the requirements to be a survival or an action-adventure game, isn't really that great within those genres, because it's not playing the same game, and that's fine. Minecraft and Gmod are still games that myself and others have dumped uncountable hours into just dicking around with all the different things you can do, and I think AC could learn something from that. With the announcement of Assetto Corsa Evo, many have wondered if it will be as successful or even as good as Assetto Corsa 1 was. And while I would want to see more from the game before casting judgment like that, what I can say is I think the trends I've noticed in how Kunos moves point in the direction of ACE being another open sandbox for players to experience their favorite cars and tracks in, but still lacking in certain key areas. And I don't mean that as a bad thing, because even though it doesn't have the best car list, the best sense of speed, or even is the best pure racing sim, it is the best at what it's trying to do. And if what it does is what you're looking for in a racing sim, it might be perfect for you. But it's definitely not a perfect racing game, and it doesn't have to be. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about my favorite racing game in the franchise that surrounds it, and I wouldn't even remotely suggest that my favorite racing game is the best racing game. But it doesn't matter, because it's my favorite, and if AC is yours, that's cool too. Just don't be annoying about it in my comments and try to suggest it's the only racing game you'll ever need. I've got some announcements in the music list, but I do plan to revisit this topic after Evo comes out, as well as looking at some other sims. But outside of that, I think I'll see y'all around. quick credits note, this is going to be my last video for a couple months because I'm working on something absolutely huge that y'all might be able to guess if y'all see what I've been posting, which is also why this video took a while, so stay tuned for that. And if you want to help support the channel while I'm away, there'll be a link to the Patreon in the description, as well as links to the Discord and Twitch if you want to come hang out with the rest of the community. Alright? Alright.